I thought it was just a flat tire, until I saw the footage. The guy didn't just park badly, he walked up to my car and deflated both tires on purpose. 2 years of endless calls, lawyers and sleepless nights followed, all while he thought he could get away with it because of who his father was. I watched my life unravel bit by bit, and every time they tried to buy me off, my anger grew, but I wasn't about to let him win. What happens when someone thinks they're untouchable, and you decide to fight back? I still remember that afternoon, like it happened yesterday, even though it's been more than 2 years now. Some memories stick with you, not because they're extraordinary, but because of the way they quietly shift the course of your life. They lodge themselves deep in your mind, becoming little landmines you step on every now and then, exploding into fragments of anger, frustration, and sometimes satisfaction. It was a Saturday, late February 2023. Lima summers are brutal, and that day was no different. The sun felt merciless, baking the city under a haze of heat. My wife Camilla and I had promised our kids Sophia and Matteo a weekend movie outing. Nothing fancy, just a little escape from the monotony of work and school. I had been working long hours at the office, deadlines piling up, and Camilla thought we all needed a break. The plan was simple: park at the multi-story lot next to Real Plaza, grab some lunch, and then hit the cinema for the latest animated movie the kids had been begging to see for weeks. It was one of those rare days where everyone was excited, where the kids weren't bickering over who gets the window seat and Camilla wasn't scrolling endlessly through her phone while sighing about errands. But like so many stories in life, this one began with something small, something so mundane, it almost didn't register as important at first. We arrived at the parking lot around 3 p.m., only to find the entire place crammed full. It was chaos. Cars were circling like vultures, families arguing over spots, impatient horns blaring in every direction. I could feel my stress level rising with every minute. We had already been driving around for what felt like forever when I finally spotted what looked like the last available space on the 3rd floor, or so I thought. There it was, an empty-looking spot, but at the very front, a black BMW 3 Series was parked like the owner thought he owned the place. The nose of the car stuck way past the line, leaving barely any room for another car to fit. I slowed down, squinting, trying to gauge the space. Camilla leaned forward, too, muttering under her breath. "Great, rich kid with daddy's money, thinks rules don't apply to him," she said. I sighed. She wasn't wrong. In Lima, you see it all the time, some entitled kid behind the wheel of a shiny car, driving like the world belongs to him. Still, I didn't want to give up just yet. I waved down the parking attendant, a young woman in her early 20s with a clipboard. Her name tag read Maria. "Senor," she said politely, "that's actually the last available space. The system says it's free." I pointed at the BMW, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged, clearly embarrassed. "I know we've told them before not to park like that," but she trailed off, her tone making it clear that complaining wouldn't change anything. I sat there for a moment, weighing my options. Leave and try another lot, which meant another 30 minutes of frustration with 2 restless kids in the back seat, or risk squeezing in. Eventually, I decided to go for it. I reversed carefully, aligning my car just right, and eased it into the space, centimeter by centimeter. By the time I finished, my car was less than 3 centimeters away from the BMW's side mirror. It was tight, so tight in fact, that I had to climb out through the passenger seat, laughing awkwardly as I nearly tripped over the gear shift. Camilla shook her head, but smiled. "All this for a movie," she muttered. We locked up, grabbed the kids, and headed out. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a small inconvenience. I didn't know yet that this was the start of a 2-year nightmare. When we came back around 6:30 p.m., arms full of leftover popcorn and half-empty soda cups, I instantly noticed something was wrong. The BMW was gone. That part wasn't surprising. I had expected the entitled little prince to be long gone by the time we returned. What caught my attention was my own car. 2 of my tires, the rear left and front right, were completely flat. I froze for a second, my brain struggling to process what I was looking at. It was the kind of confusion that quickly hardens into anger, the kind that makes your heart pound in your ears. Camilla was the first to speak. "Oh no, no, don't tell me someone actually." I crouched down, touching one of the tires, deflated, dead flat. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a slow leak or a nail on the road. That was deliberate. My stomach dropped, and I could feel the heat rising to my face. Someone had done this on purpose, and I already had a pretty damn good idea who. I stormed back to find Maria, the parking attendant, and dragged her over to see the car. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "I'll call my manager," she said, fumbling for her radio. Within minutes, the manager was on the line. He said they'd send someone from their service team to inflate the tires and suggested I wait. He promised they'd handle everything, and assured me I wouldn't have to pay for any damage if it wasn't my fault. But his tone was rehearsed, too calm, like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Camilla was frustrated, and the kids were getting cranky. After a few minutes of tense silence, she sighed and called a taxi to take them home. "I'll deal with the kids," she said softly, squeezing my hand before leaving. "Just don't let this ruin the whole night." But the night was already ruined. I stood there alone in the oppressive summer heat, staring at my car, replaying the whole thing in my head. The BMW, the way it was parked, the entitlement dripping from that invisible owner I hadn't even met yet. It didn't feel random, it felt personal. The longer I waited, the more it burned. Finally, I took out my phone and called the police. If someone thought they could screw with me and get away with it, they were wrong. This was the moment the story shifted. I didn't know it then, but what happened next would stretch across months, testing my patience, my principles, and my faith in the system. I wasn't just angry about 2 flat tires. I was angry about what it represented, the arrogance, the casual cruelty of someone who thought they could ruin my day and face no consequences. I made a silent promise to myself right there in that parking lot. Whoever did this was going to pay, and I was ready to see it through, no matter how long it took. I thought calling the police that night would solve everything. I thought there'd be an investigation, a report, maybe a couple of weeks before the guy was caught and made to pay for what he'd done. I had no idea how naive that was. That night, 2 officers arrived at the parking lot, about 40 minutes after I called. By then, the mechanic sent by the parking company had already shown up and started inflating my tires. He checked them carefully and confirmed what I already knew: the air had been deliberately let out. There were no punctures, no slashes. Someone had used the valve caps to quietly release the air. The officers asked me a few basic questions: time of arrival, where I parked, if I noticed anyone suspicious. I told them everything, including the BMW that had been blocking the spot when I first arrived. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever owned that car was behind this, though at the time I didn't have proof. When I asked for the parking lot's CCTV footage, Maria, the attendant, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, senor," she said, glancing nervously at the officers. "Company policy says we can only give it to the police after a formal complaint." So right there in the middle of the sweltering parking lot, I filed an official vandalism report. The officers told me they'd request the video and get back to me. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could finally go home, sleep it off, and get on with my life. I was wrong. The next 3 months tested my patience in ways I didn't know possible. Every week, I called the parking company to ask about the video footage. Every time, I got the same answer: "We're processing it, senor. Please wait." At first I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Bureaucracy is slow, I told myself. But as weeks turned into months, my frustration hardened into anger. Finally, one of the officers on my case admitted that the parking company had been sending useless footage to the police, first the wrong camera, then the right camera, but from the wrong time frame. 3 months. 3 entire months just to get the right video. By then, I was exhausted. Camila was starting to get irritated too. Every night, she'd ask, "Is this really worth it?" I understood where she was coming from. We weren't rich. Lawyers cost money, the kids needed school supplies, and rent wasn't getting any cheaper. But I couldn't let it go. It wasn't just about the tires anymore, it was about principle. I'd been raised to believe that if someone wronged you, you stood up for yourself. My father used to tell me la justicia tarda, pero llega, justice may be slow, but it comes eventually. I clung to those words like a lifeline. Finally, one late May afternoon, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "Senor," the officer said, "we have the full footage now. You should come in." When I arrived at the station, they played the video on a small dusty monitor in a cramped back office. And there it was, the confirmation I had been waiting for. I watched as a young man, maybe 22 or 23, walked up to my car. He stopped in front of it, stared at it for a few seconds, then turned and looked straight into the camera, like he knew it was there but didn't care. He made a few angry gestures, muttering something I couldn't hear. Then he climbed into the black BMW, reversed out of the space, parked a little farther down, and got out again. And then I watched him do it. He crouched down by my rear tire, twisted the valve, and let all the air out. Then he walked around to the front, did the same thing, and strolled back to his shiny BMW like he'd just taken a casual walk in the park. It was surreal. The officers paused the video and zoomed in on his license plate. The system matched it immediately, registered to Martin Castillo, 22 years old, enrolled at a prestigious private university in Lima. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and rage. Satisfaction because I finally had proof. Rage because seeing his smug little face on that screen made my blood boil. I amended my complaint immediately, upgrading it from a vehicle incident to vandalism. From that moment, Martin wasn't just some nameless jerk. He was the guy who thought he could ruin my day and walk away without consequences. But things didn't move quickly after that. If anything, they slowed down. By August, nearly 6 months after the incident, I finally got a letter inviting me to an arbitration meeting. It was basically a chance to settle things outside the judicial system. I refused. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about accountability. If I agreed to arbitration, Martin would get off with a slap on the wrist, probably paying a small fine and laughing about it later with his friends. I wasn't going to let that happen. I sent back my refusal in writing and attached it to my complaint. A week later, I got my first call from Martin's lawyer. He introduced himself politely, using the kind of rehearsed tone you hear in TV ads. Then he got straight to the point. "Senor, my client is very sorry." He acted out of anger. "He's a young man, and young men make mistakes. We're willing to offer you a few thousand sols to drop the case." I didn't even hesitate. "No," I said flatly. He tried again, softening his voice, pretending to be empathetic. "It's really not worth dragging this through the courts. We can resolve this amicably. You don't want to spend the next year fighting, do you?" I told him two things. First, that I wasn't interested in any settlement, and second, that I didn't want to be contacted again. But they didn't listen. Every couple of months after that, I'd get calls from different lawyers, each representing Martin or his father, all with slightly different offers. One offered 6,000 sols, another promised a brand new set of premium tires, one even hinted at a free membership to a luxury club Martin's father owned. Each time I refused, and added their offers to my case file. My lawyer, an older man named Ricardo, told me to document everything, every call, every text, every email. He said, "This isn't just about the money anymore, it's about proving harassment." By now, nearly a year had passed since that hot February afternoon. It was January 2024, when I finally got my court date, January 14, 2025. 11 months away. 11 months of waiting, preparing, documenting and enduring endless phone calls from Martin's legal team. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made the wrong choice. Maybe Camila was right. Maybe it wasn't worth the stress, the lawyer's fees, the constant back and forth. But then I'd picture Martin's smug little face crouched next to my tire, deliberately screwing with my car like my time, my money, my day meant nothing. And every time the anger came back, I couldn't let it go, not anymore. The breaking point wasn't just the tires, it wasn't even the months of delays, the endless phone calls, or the sleepless nights. The breaking point was realizing how easy it would have been to walk away. I could have taken the money. I could have let Martine learn nothing from this. But deep down, I knew that if I did, I'd spend the rest of my life regretting it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for Camila, for Sophia, and Matteo. It was about showing them that sometimes, when someone wrongs you, you have to fight, even if the fight is long and exhausting. So I doubled down. I stopped answering Martine's lawyers entirely. I stopped letting their offers distract me. I focused everything on preparing for that court date, knowing it was still nearly a year away. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt steady. Not calm, not happy, but steady. Because now, I had something to look forward to. January 14, 2025. The day Martine would finally face consequences. The months leading up to the court date were some of the hardest of my life. I thought that once I had the CCTV footage, once the police identified Martine, and once the legal process officially began, I'd finally be able to breathe. But it was the opposite. The waiting was worse than the incident itself. It's strange how something so small, 2 deflated tires, could spiral into something that consumed nearly every part of my life. But that's what happened. By February 2024, a full year after that day in the parking lot, my routine had changed completely. I used to be the kind of guy who worked hard, came home, had dinner with Camila and the kids, and slept peacefully through the night. But after months of chasing paperwork, arguing with lawyers, and fending off settlement calls, I wasn't the same person anymore. I'd lie awake until 2 or 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my head over and over again. I couldn't stop thinking about Martine's smug little gestures before he crouched down by my tires. It was like he wasn't just messing with my car, he was mocking me, daring me to do something about it. The frustration started bleeding into everything else. Camila and I began arguing more than we ever had before. At first, she supported me completely, but by March, she started questioning whether this fight was worth it. 2 years, Diego, she'd say quietly while washing dishes late at night. You've been carrying this anger for 2 years. You barely laugh anymore. You barely sleep. What's the point? He's not worth it. And maybe she was right. But whenever she said that, it only made me more determined. It's not about him, I'd tell her. It's about the principle. It's about showing our kids that people can't just get away with things like this. She'd sigh and shake her head, but she never pushed me too hard. I think deep down she understood, even if she hated how much of me this whole thing had consumed. By April, the constant stress started showing up at work too. I'm a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, and normally, I thrive under pressure. But I began missing deadlines, forgetting meetings, snapping at co-workers over tiny mistakes. One afternoon, my boss pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. Family stuff. I lied. I couldn't bring myself to explain the truth. How could I? How could I say, I'm falling apart, because a spoiled rich kid let the air out of my tires without sounding ridiculous? But it wasn't ridiculous, at least not to me. It wasn't about the tires anymore. It was about the months of gaslighting from Martine's lawyers, the endless bureaucracy, the fact that the system moved at a glacial pace, while I was the one losing sleep, money and peace of mind. By June 2024, I started noticing something else: paranoia. I'd catch myself scanning parking lots every time I left my car somewhere, checking my tires like a man obsessed. I'd look twice at every BMW I saw, half expecting Martine to pop out and start smirking at me. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. because I thought I heard someone fiddling with my car outside. I rushed out in my boxers, clutching the baseball bat I keep by the bed, only to find the street completely silent. Camila came out onto the porch, arms crossed, her expression halfway between worry and exhaustion. "You can't keep living like this," she whispered. And I knew she was right. But knowing it and fixing it are two very different things. The calls from Martine's lawyers didn't stop either. By mid-2024, I'd lost count of how many times they'd tried to negotiate with me. Some were polite, others were aggressive. One guy called in July and practically threatened me, saying I'd regret dragging this into court
that Martin's family had influence. I documented every single call. Ricardo, my lawyer, told me to keep everything. They're trying to break you, he said one evening over coffee. They want you exhausted enough to settle. Don't give them what they want. Ricardo was a good man, but even he warned me about the risks. Martin's father, Javier Castillo, wasn't just rich, he was connected. He owned a string of luxury auto dealerships across Lima and had friends in high places. Ricardo admitted, off the record, that there was always a chance they'd try to delay the case endlessly or lean on someone behind the scenes. It didn't help my paranoia one bit. By August, Sofia and Mateo started asking questions. Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for, and they picked up on the tension between Camila and me. One evening, Sofia, who had just turned 8, sat beside me on the couch, holding her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Papi," she said softly, "why are you so angry all the time?" I froze. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father's been locked in a 2-year war over a pair of tires? How do you tell her that the anger isn't just about the incident, it's about feeling powerless, about watching someone with money and connections try to buy their way out of consequences? I hugged her tightly and told her the simplest truth I could manage. Sometimes, Sophie, people do bad things, and sometimes you have to be strong and stand up for what's right. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, but the weight of her question stayed with me for days. September came, then October, then November. Each passing month chipped away at me a little more. My savings account was thinning from legal fees. My marriage was strained, though Camila and I tried to hold it together for the kids. Work was stressful, home was tense, and the looming court date cast a long shadow over everything. The holidays that year felt hollow. Camila tried to make Christmas special, but my mind kept wandering back to January 14th. That date had become an obsession, a symbol, a lifeline. I'd circled it on every calendar in the house, counting down the days like a prisoner scratching lines into a wall. Ricardo checked in with me regularly, reminding me to stay patient. "We have the video," he'd say. "That's our ace." He can't deny it. But patience was wearing thin. There were nights I genuinely wondered if Martin would get away with it, if somehow, some way, his family would pull strings, and I'd be left standing there like a fool, broke, bitter, and beaten. Those nights were the hardest. January 2025 finally arrived, and with it, a kind of quiet dread. I barely slept the week leading up to the trial. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, pacing the living room, practicing things I might need to say. Camila avoided bringing it up, but I could feel her anxiety in the little ways. The way she double-checked my suit, the way she packed extra water bottles and tissues in my bag like we were preparing for war. The morning of January 14th, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, staring at the man looking back at me. I barely recognized him. 2 years. 2 years of stress, exhaustion, and waiting had left their mark. My hair was thinner, the circles under my eyes darker, the lines around my mouth deeper. But beneath the fatigue, there was something else, a kind of steel. This was it. The day Martin would finally face the consequences of what he'd done.
January 14th, 2025. The day I'd been waiting for, dreading, obsessing over, and clinging to, had finally arrived. After 2 years of sleepless nights, endless paperwork, harassing phone calls, and tense arguments, it all came down to this. The courthouse was in the heart of Lima, an old, imposing building with chipped white columns and heavy wooden doors that seemed to swallow people whole as they entered. The sky was overcast, grey and moody, as though even the weather knew something big was about to happen. I arrived an hour early with Ricardo, my lawyer, who looked calmer than I'd ever seen him. I envied that calm. My palms were sweating, my chest was tight, and my mind kept flashing back to every moment from the past 2 years. The day in the parking lot, the endless calls, the nights I couldn't sleep. Camila was there too. She sat beside me in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding my hand in silence. It was strange. We hadn't talked much about the case in the days leading up to this, but just having her there grounded me. She didn't have to say anything. Her presence was enough. When the courtroom doors finally opened, I felt my stomach flip. We stepped inside, and my eyes immediately found Martin. He was sitting at the defendant's table, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. His hair was perfectly styled, his watch gleaming. Beside him sat his father, Javier Castillo, looking every bit the wealthy businessman, sharp suit, cold expression, and an aura of untouchable power. And then there was their lawyer, a polished man in his 40s, confident and composed, the kind of person who looked like he'd never lost a case in his life. For a brief moment, I felt small, like I didn't belong there, like I was about to be crushed under the weight of money, influence, and arrogance. But then I remembered the video. I remembered Martin crouched by my tires, twisting the valves, deflating them with deliberate, petty malice. That image snapped me back to reality. This wasn't about power, this was about truth. Before the proceedings began, Martin's lawyer made one final attempt to settle. He approached Ricardo and quietly offered us 20,000 sols, if I agreed to drop the case right then and there. Ricardo didn't even glance at me for confirmation before rejecting it. We'd talked about this possibility months ago, and my answer hadn't changed. No amount of money was worth giving up justice. When the offer failed, Martin's lawyer sighed, adjusted his tie, and walked back to his table. I noticed Martin smirking, as if he still believed he'd walk out untouched. That smirk would haunt me for the next hour. The judge entered the room, a stern woman in her late 50s, named Magistrada Salazar. Her presence commanded immediate silence. She opened the session, and Martin's lawyer launched into his defense first. His strategy was predictable. Paint Martin as a young man who'd made a minor mistake, argue that this was a simple misunderstanding, and suggest that dragging it into court was excessive. He spoke smoothly, confidently, emphasizing Martin's youth, his bright future, and the fact that no permanent damage had been caused. I sat there clenching my fists, biting the inside of my cheek, forcing myself to stay quiet. Then it was Ricardo's turn. Ricardo stood, buttoned his jacket, and calmly began presenting our case. He laid out the facts step by step, starting from the day of the incident, the months of delays from the parking company, the repeated settlement offers, and finally, the video. When he mentioned the CCTV footage, Martin shifted uncomfortably for the first time. His smirk faltered just slightly, and I felt a small flicker of hope. Ricardo asked the court to play the video. The lights dimmed slightly, and the footage appeared on the screen at the front of the room. And there it was, crystal clear, undeniable. Martin walked into frame, glanced at my car, made an exaggerated gesture of frustration, and then methodically deflated both my tires. He didn't look rushed, he didn't look panicked. He looked angry, but calm, in control, fully aware of what he was doing. The video ended, and for a few seconds, there was silence. I glanced over at Martin, and saw the color drain from his face. Javier leaned toward him, whispering furiously, his jaw tight. Their lawyer's polished confidence seemed to crack just slightly. Ricardo turned back to the judge, his voice steady. "This was not a mistake," he said. "This was deliberate, calculated vandalism, and for 2 years, instead of apologizing, they tried to buy my client's silence. They underestimated his patience, his persistence, and his belief in fairness. Now, Your Honor, we are simply asking for accountability." When it was my turn to speak, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear myself. I stood, cleared my throat, and tried to keep my voice from shaking. I told the court about that day, about parking in the last spot, about coming back with my family to find 2 deflated tires, about standing there, alone in the heat, waiting for a mechanic, while my wife took the kids home in a taxi. I talked about the stress, the endless delays, the countless settlement calls, the way it seeped into my marriage, my work, and even my sleep. And then I said the one thing I'd been holding on to for 2 years. This isn't about tires, this is about respect, about accountability, about what happens when someone with money thinks they're untouchable. I'm here today because I want to prove that they're not. When I sat down, I felt lighter. Not calm, not yet, but lighter. After both sides finished, the judge called for a short recess. I stepped outside the courtroom, with Ricardo and Camila, pacing the hallway, trying to keep my breathing steady. Ricardo patted my shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. When we went back in, the atmosphere felt different, tense, heavy. Everyone knew which way this was heading. Magistrada Salazar returned, reviewed the evidence one final time, and delivered her verdict. Martín Castillo was guilty of common vandalism. The sentence, a 50-day fine at 50% income, totaling the equivalent of $1,700 USD, plus 90 days of home arrest. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard the ruling. Relief washed over me in a rush so intense it was almost dizzying. But Martín, he sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his fists tight, his perfect little world cracking right there in front of him. Javier slammed his hand down on the table, whispering angrily to the lawyer. They weren't used to losing. Of course they appealed. 2 weeks later, Ricardo called me and said Martín's legal team had filed for an appeal, hoping to overturn the ruling. For a moment my heart sank, but he reassured me it wouldn't go anywhere. And he was right. A few weeks later, the appeal was dismissed. By April 2025, the verdict was final. Martín had to pay me by October 10, 2025, or face jail time instead of home arrest. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd finally get to move on. But Martín wasn't done yet. On October 9, one day before the deadline, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Martín's father. His voice was tight, cold, stripped of the arrogance I'd come to expect. He asked for my bank account details so they could make the payment immediately. An hour later, the transfer hit my account. 2 years. 2 years of waiting, fighting, and refusing to give in. And finally, it was over. Or so I thought. Because later that night, I learned something that made the victory even sweeter. Martín's university didn't accept home arrest as a valid excuse for missing classes, which meant he'd lose all his credits for the current semester. 2 years of patience, 2 years of stress. And in the end, Martín's arrogance cost him far more than he ever expected. Standing on my balcony that night, the warm spring air brushing against my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 long years, peace. Not because I'd won, not because of the money, but because for once, someone who thought they were untouchable finally faced consequences. And that was worth every sleepless night. By the time October rolled around, 2 years had passed since that sweltering February afternoon, when I first parked in that impossible space. 2 years of waiting, fighting, arguing, pacing, and obsessing over something that on the surface might have seemed trivial. But for me, it had become a battle for dignity, patience, and the principle that no one is above accountability. When the money finally hit my account on October 9th, I remember staring at it in disbelief. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't life-changing, in any practical sense, but it symbolized something far greater. It symbolized the end of a nightmare. It symbolized a rare moment where patience, perseverance, and refusal to be intimidated actually paid off. I called Camila immediately. She answered with the tired but warm voice of someone who had carried the emotional weight of my obsession alongside me. "They did it," I said simply. "I know," she replied, and for the first time in weeks we both laughed, a real laugh, the kind that eases tension from your shoulders and loosens your chest after holding your breath for too long. The kids were overjoyed too, though for very different reasons. Mateo was fascinated by the concept of home arrest, asking if Martín would have to sleep in his room the whole time. Sophia, now 8 and a little wiser about the world, looked at me seriously and said, "Good, people who are mean need to learn lessons." Her words made me pause, and I realized how much this whole ordeal had become a lesson, not just in law and justice, but in life. Looking back now, I can see how those 2 flat tires were just the first spark in a firestorm that reshaped nearly every aspect of my life. It tested me, tested my marriage, tested my patience and my mental fortitude. There were nights when I felt like giving up.
Nights when Camila's quiet questions about whether it was worth it cut deeper than any insult or slight from Martine ever could. But giving up would have meant surrendering my own values. It would have meant showing my kids that people can trample over you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's not the lesson I wanted to teach them. After the verdict became final, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Relief that justice was served. Exhaustion from the constant vigilance, from the paranoia, from watching my every step and my every call to ensure I wasn't being intimidated or manipulated. I allowed myself a brief period of reflection, thinking about Martine and his family. I didn't feel the desire for revenge anymore, that had long faded. What I felt instead was a quiet satisfaction. The legal system, slow and frustrating as it was, had worked. The arrogance of someone who thought they could act with impunity had been checked. And sometimes, that is the sweetest kind of justice. I even thought about what this would teach Martine. Not just the financial consequences, but the social ones. Losing credits at his university, enduring home arrest, being a cautionary tale for other entitled kids who think the world bends to their will. I couldn't help but smirk quietly when I imagined him pacing around his apartment, unable to attend classes, forced to confront the results of his impulsive, thoughtless actions. For me, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. I started sleeping better, my focus at work improved, and the tension that had hung over my household finally began to lift. Camila and I rebuilt the quiet rhythm we'd lost, dinners with laughter, weekend outings without fear, and a sense of calm that had been missing for far too long. But there was also a subtle change in me. I realized how fragile patience can be, how much energy standing up for yourself can consume, and how long it can take to achieve justice when wealth and influence tip the scales in someone else's favor. I became more vigilant, more cautious, and at the same time, more determined not to let injustice slide unnoticed. I also realized something else, how small acts of courage, even over something as mundane as 2 tires, can resonate far beyond their immediate impact. I had learned that persistence matters, that documentation, attention to detail, and a refusal to back down can actually shift outcomes, even when the odds are stacked against you. And yet, despite everything, there was forgiveness lurking somewhere in the corners of my mind. Not for Martine's actions, that wasn't necessary, but for myself. I forgave myself for the nights I'd lost sleep, for the moments I let anger consume me, for the times I might have snapped at Camila in frustration. I forgave myself for letting something external dictate so much of my emotional life, because in the end, I had endured, and I had emerged stronger. The kids learned something too. They learned that standing up for yourself can be a long, exhausting journey, but that it's worth it when it's the right thing. Sophia, especially, seemed to understand this on a deeper level. She'd catch me sometimes staring out at the street, lost in thought, and she'd simply say, "Puppy, you were brave." And in those moments, I realized that bravery isn't just about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about the quiet refusal to be intimidated, about showing up, documenting the truth, and seeing it through to the end. By the end of October, Martine's payment had been processed, and the legal chapter was officially closed. Home arrest had begun for him, and I received confirmation that everything was settled. The relief was palpable, but more importantly, there was closure. I walked past that same parking lot months later, the place where it had all started. Cars moved in and out, attendants waved politely, and life went on as if nothing had happened. I stood for a moment, thinking about how one small act of arrogance, a deflated tire, had consumed so much of my life, and yet ultimately taught me lessons I wouldn't trade for anything. And I smiled quietly to myself, because in the end, justice had been served. And I had learned that persistence, patience, and refusal to be intimidated are forces more powerful than money, influence, or arrogance. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to let someone else's selfishness define your life. Standing on my balcony that night, I felt a deep sense of calm. Camila joined me with a cup of tea, and the kids were already asleep upstairs. I looked out over Lima, the city sprawling endlessly under the soft glow of streetlights, and thought about how far we'd come as a family. I had been tested, but I had endured. I had fought for what was right, and it had mattered. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Justice wasn't just a word on a legal document anymore. It was a lived experience, a victory earned through persistence, patience, and an unwillingness to back down. And I hoped Martin would remember that, every single day of his home arrest, because some lessons are worth waiting for.